Warner Bros. Was once worth over $100 billion. Today, this legendary studio has lost half of its value, and it's desperately pawning itself off for sale like a cheap escort. How did one of Hollywood's most prestigious studios fall so far, so fast? From the golden age of animation that rivaled Disney, to becoming Hollywood's premier director studio that gave us the Dark Knight trilogy, the Harry Potter movies, and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. But today, they're shutting down gaming studios, and Cartoon Network, once the crown jewel of children's entertainment, is effectively dead. This is the story of decades of mismanagement, a revolving door of executives, and a company that lost its identity chasing trends instead of setting them. While Disney was having their renaissance in the 90s, Warner Bros. Wasn't just sitting idle. They were creating some of the most iconic animated content in television history. Batman the Animated Series revolutionized superhero animation with its dark, mature storytelling and Art Deco aesthetic. Animaniacs had sharp, clever humor that appealed both to kids and adults. Tiny Toons introduced a new generation to the Looney Tunes characters. And there was also Superman the Animated Series and Batman Beyond. The list goes on. Warner Bros. Wasn't trying to be like Disney. They carved their own path by making smarter content and trusting their audience's intelligence. They got so good at this that they launched their own network just for animation.
On behalf of the Turner Broadcasting System, I want to welcome you to the launch of the world's only and first Cartoon Network.
In 1992, Warner Bros. Launched Cartoon Network, and it became a cultural phenomenon throughout the 90s and early 2000s. They had massive hits like Dexter's Laboratory, The Powerpuff Girls, Johnny Bravo, and my personal favorites, Courage the Cowardly Dog. There was also Eden and Eddie and Samurai Jack. Cartoon Network had an identity, and it resonated with millions of people worldwide. It was so successful that they launched Adult Swim in 2001. It was a late-night block that attracted older audiences with shows like Space Ghost Coast to Coast, and later adding original anime programming. They understood their audience and gave them content that respected their intelligence. But Warner Bros.' crown jewel was their reputation as a director's studio. Unlike other studios that micromanage creative visions, Warner Bros. Gave filmmakers creative freedom. After the success of Memento, Warner Bros. Trusted Christopher Nolan, who was an indie director at the time, with Batman leading to the Dark Knight trilogy, and it became one of the most critically acclaimed superhero franchises ever made. WB also bet big on the Lord of the Rings trilogy. They let Peter Jackson film all 3 movies simultaneously in New Zealand. The gamble paid off with billions at the box office and 17 Academy Awards. The Harry Potter franchise also had 8 films that grossed over $7 billion at the box office, and it became a cultural phenomenon that defined an entire generation. WB understood that great filmmakers make great films. If you give them the resources and creative freedom, they will deliver box office gold. This philosophy was spearheaded by one man. He was the architect behind the golden age for Warner Brothers, especially in film. He took risks on artists who delivered iconic movies that are forever in the zeitgeist. But unfortunately, that wouldn't last forever. Everything changed in 2013. Alan Horn, who had been the president and COO of Warner Bros. Entertainment from 1999 to 2011, was forced to retire at the behest of Time Warner chairman Jeffrey Bewix. Jeffrey wanted to groom younger talent to take over the studio. So in 2013, Kevin Tsujihara took over as chairman and CEO. And this is where the real shift happened. As the head of Warner Bros. Entertainment, he wasn't just in charge of the film studio. He oversaw the animation, gaming, home entertainment, DC, and the music division of WB. All these execs reported directly to him. Tsujihara represented a fundamental shift in philosophy. Warner Bros. Went from being a director's studio to an IP-driven studio. The focus moved away from empowering creative voices to exploiting intellectual property. This was an effort to, and I quote, to keep pace with the digital age and expand the company's global reach. This shift wasn't exclusive to Warner Bros. It was happening to Disney as well. And if we're being honest, it was happening to the rest of Hollywood at this time as well. Studios were trying to keep up with tech companies and they chose to leverage their IPs. But the problem here was that Warner Bros. Were already playing catch-up to Disney. Disney had already purchased Lucasfilm and Marvel, so this started a new arms race for IP consolidation, and it ushered in the era of the cinematic universe.
Not a great plan.
After seeing the success of Marvel's Avengers 2012, Kevin Tsujihara pushed for a DC cinematic universe. But unfortunately, he rushed it. Man of Steel was meant to be a standalone Superman reboot. They applied the gritty, darker tone that made the Dark Knight trilogy successful, and the movie became the first financially successful DC film that wasn't Batman in 30 years. But instead of expanding Superman's lore in a proper Superman sequel, Kevin Sujihara pushed for it to be used as the foundation for a hastily constructed cinematic universe. Enter Batman vs. Superman. BVS was never intended to be the second film in this universe. It is also undeniable that the original intent with Man of Steel was to launch a Superman franchise, and Snyder and the others said repeatedly that their desire to eventually build a larger DC world would come after Superman was a bit more developed and up and running. However, the studio desired to move beyond a solo Superman and push aside a standalone sequel in favor of something to ramp up their larger DC plans. Not only was the universe rushed, the theatrical cut of BVS was chopped down so theaters could squeeze in more screenings per day. This led to a disjointed movie that had pacing issues. The extended cut showed what the film should have been, but the damage was already done. As much as Kevin Sujihara wanted to Marvelize DC, so far WB only copied Marvel's structure. The movie still had a darker tone. This was because of Greg Silverman. He was one of the last few execs at Warner Brothers who still believed in the director's first philosophy, so he often fought to preserve Zack's tone and creative vision. He was the last line of defense after Alan Horn was ousted, but unfortunately, he was also fired in 2016. Toby Emmerich replaced Greg Silverman as the head of Warner Bros. Pictures. And this was probably the worst thing to happen to Warner Bros. In 2 decades. Because while Kevin Sujihara pushed for DC to emulate Marvel's formula structurally, Toby Emmerich took it a step further. He started bringing Marvel directors and fully transformed DC into Marvel 2.0. However, Justice League 2017 proved that this was a terrible idea. After Snyder left the project due to a family tragedy, the studio brought in Joss Whedon for extensive reshoots, resulting in a Frankensteinish monster of conflicting tones. The film bombed at the box office and became one of the most ridiculed movies of all time. The irony is that when WB let directors actually direct, they succeeded. Aquaman worked because they let James Gunn make his movie, mainly because it had a lighter tone compared to BVS, but they still gave him creative freedom. The Joker also became a billion-dollar film because they gave Todd Phillips creative freedom, but that movie almost didn't see the light of day because the head of DC at the time, Walter Hamada, did everything in his power to bury it. But because it was a mid to low budget, they let Todd Phillips do whatever he wanted. These successes were the exception in an era of corporate mandates, because a few years later, we saw DC movies fully Marvelized and micromanaged. This created one of the worst slate of movies that any studio would be ashamed of. The same directors that delivered good movies followed them up with one of the worst superhero movies ever made, mainly because these were studio-mandated sequels made to fit into a content pipeline, instead of having a genuinely interesting premise. And the unfortunate thing here is that animation suffered much worse. By the 2010s, Cartoon Network was changing. The shows that defined the 2000s were ending. Adventure Time was decent. It showed that Cartoon Network still had it. The regular show was another hit. Steven Universe was beloved by fans, but it had inconsistent scheduling. But Teen Titans Go is where things went wrong. Teen Titans Go represented everything wrong with modern Cartoon Network. It was cheap to produce and required minimal creative oversight. It could run constantly. Cartoon Network discovered that they could fill their schedule with Teen Titans Go marathons instead of investing in diverse programming. Original content dried up and shows were poorly promoted. By the late 2010s, Cartoon Network stopped being the destination for original animation. But the troubles didn't end here. Warner Bros. Animation, the studio that produced Batman the Animated Series, also declined. Their feature film animation division struggled to compete with Disney and Pixar. Films like Quest for Camelot and Looney Tunes Back in Action underperformed at the box office. Eventually, they pretty much left theatrically released animation. The death blow came with corporate restructuring. In 2022, WB shut down multiple animated projects, including HBO Max shows that were already in production, and dozens of animators lost their jobs. The message was crystal clear. Animation wasn't a priority. In 2024, Cartoon Network effectively ceased to exist as an independent entity. It was basically absorbed by Warner Bros. Discovery's restructuring. The network that defined a generation was essentially gone. So you would think destroying their film and animation divisions would be enough. Surely, they would get the message by now that they're doing something wrong, right? Wrong! WB Games was once a powerhouse. The Batman Arkham series set a new standard for superhero games and licensed adaptations. These weren't the cash grab tie-in games that we were accustomed to. They were carefully crafted experiences that respected the source material. They were era-defining games like Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor, and Shadow of War, which was a massive innovation with the Nemesis system. For non-gamers out there, the Nemesis system basically allowed enemy characters to remember your encounters, creating personal rivalries that evolved dynamically. It was a revolutionary mechanic that no one else replicated. Even Mortal Kombat made a comeback with a reboot, and it was a massive hit. It was so successful that it spawned the Injustice games. WB Games understood that quality titles built franchises. But then came the push for live service games. Every publisher saw the success of Fortnite and wanted their piece. Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League was a live service shooter that nobody asked for, and for some reason it was set in the same universe as the Arkham games. It was basically a spit in the face of the legacy of those games. Multiverses launched with some initial interest, but it fell off and eventually shut down. There was eventually a relaunch of the game, but it had minimal interest. Gotham Knights was a mediocre game that felt dated on arrival. And as a result of these failures, WB Games shut down 3 internal studios. Player First Games, the San Diego team, and Monolith Productions was heavily downsized. The official reason? Strategic restructuring to focus on major franchises like Harry Potter and Mortal Kombat. Translation? Abandoning creativity and innovation to milk existing IP. And surprise, surprise, the next Harry Potter game is reportedly another live service attempt. They have learned nothing. In 2022, Discovery merged with Warner Media, creating Warner Bros. Discovery. David Zaslav became the CEO, and he immediately started cost-cutting. $3 billion in content was written off for tax purposes. Batgirl was a completed film that was shelved and never released. Multiple HBO Max shows were cancelled, some of them mid-production. HBO Max rebranded to just Max, because branding doesn't matter, I guess. They eventually changed it back to HBO Max after realizing that it was a really stupid decision. Zaslav's strategy was to cut costs and focus on profitability. In theory, that's reasonable, but in practice, it was devastating. He hired Mike DeLuca and Pam Abdi to run the film studio, and to their credit, they've done a good job. Barbie was a massive hit, Dune Part 2 was critically acclaimed and profitable, and WB has made more money at the box office than any other studio this year. The grass is green in Warner Bros. Film studio at the moment, but DC has been constantly hemorrhaging money. In 2022, Zaslav brought in James Gunn and Peter Safran to run DC Studios and announced a complete reboot of the DC universe. A bold slate was announced: a Superman film, a Batman film, The Authority, Supergirl, Swamp Thing, and more. DC fans were over the moon. Finally, a DC plan. But here's the thing. James Gunn announced a reboot while they still had 4 movies left to release. That went as well as you would expect. The Flash was a disastrous box office bomb. Shazam 2 flopped. Blue Beetle flopped, Aquaman 2 flopped, and the following year, Joker 2 was also a disastrous flop. Yet, the announcement of a DC universe seemingly increased the value of Warner Bros. Stock. It seemed that despite their failures, the possibility of a successful cinematic universe in the future made the company look more of an attractive prospect for potential buyers. But considering the fact that James Gunn's DCU projects have all underperformed so far, was hiring him genuine, or was it a strategic move to inflate the company's value before a sale? It seems like we finally have an answer to that. Warner Bros. Is officially for sale. It seems pretty evident that selling the company was Zaslav's intentions from the get-go. He's finally getting what he wants. Paramount seem to be the most likely buyers. They've been very aggressive so far, and let's not forget the fact that they have connections with the Trump administration. And when they buy WB, they're going to get rid of Gunn and Safran, especially if the DCU movies flop next year, which is very likely. DCU fans are so desperate that they're starting to spread false information that David Ellison said that he would keep James Gunn as the head of DC. The article literally doesn't name Gunn at all. This shows that DC fans are terrified of what comes next. Other buyers include tech giants, streaming services, and investment firms. But time will tell what would happen. In the meantime, let's summarize how Warner Bros. Got themselves in this position. There has been a revolving door of executives since 2013. Each new exec brings a new vision, cancelling the previous regime's projects. WB went from being innovators to followers. Now they are chasing trends instead of setting them. They rushed a DC universe to copy Marvel, and now they keep pushing for live service games to copy Fortnite. They've been destroying the creative culture that made them what they were. The director-studio reputation is gone. Filmmakers know that WB will interfere, recut their films, and scapegoat them if the project fails. Why would the best talent want to work at the studio that doesn't trust them? Because behind every cancelled show, every shuttered studio, every tax write-off, there are thousands of artists, animators, developers, and creators who lost their jobs or saw years of work destroyed for tax purposes. This isn't corporate mismanagement, it's the destruction of creative communities. So the question is, what comes next? Warner Bros. Are at a crossroads. The company that gave us Looney Tunes, The Dark Knight, and revolutionized televised animation is now a cautionary tale for corporate mismanagement. So let's look at multiple scenarios. Scenario 1. A buyer comes in who understands WB's legacy. They rebuild the animation divisions, return to the director's studio model, and invest in long-term franchise building. The sleeping giant awakens. Scenario 2. A buyer purchases WB for its IP library and continues to strip mine it for content. The Warner Bros. Name becomes a hollow brand slapped to generic products, and the legacy dies. Scenario 3. WB is split up and sold in pieces. The game division goes to one buyer, the film studio to another, the animation library to a third. The company would cease to exist as a unified entity. WB's downfall is a warning about corporate entertainment in the digital age. When studios prioritize earnings over creative vision, they fail. When they chase trends instead of setting them, they become irrelevant. When they treat artists as expendable resources instead of the source of value, they lose their culture. When they focus on IP exploitation instead of storytelling, they lose their audience. Warner Brothers isn't alone in this. Other studios like Disney are also making the same mistakes. But WB's fall is especially tragic because they had everything: legacy, talent, resources, reputation, and they squandered it through short-sighted decision-making and a revolving door of leadership. So is Warner Brothers doomed to fail? Maybe. Or maybe this could be the greatest comeback of all time. One thing is certain, the next few years will determine whether Warner Brothers becomes a case study in corporate resurrection or a cautionary tale of how to destroy a century-old legacy. Either way, this catastrophic downfall didn't need to happen. And that might be the saddest part.